Today I'm going to be talking about the maniple swap. Now some of you may be asking yourselves, what's a maniple swap? And that is a good question, because I'm going to contend that really nobody knows. But the idea is that a maniple, which was a unit of Roman soldiers, and I'm going to be talking principally about the period around the Second Punic War, because I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but I'm doing a graphic novel called In Search of Hannibal, and you can pre-order it at this address. And anyway, in that I'm going to show Roman soldiers fighting in the way that they fought in the period, and I'd quite like to show a maniple swap at some point, and I'd like to get it right, but what is a maniple swap? Well, it's a unit of troops, and it was made up of two centuries. So you had one century of something like 60 or 64 men and another one. And together these would be one maniple. So it's a unit of the army, and they would be a maniple of hastati towards the front of the army, and they would be the first heavy troops to smash into the enemy, and behind them would be principes, and behind them would be a half-size line of triarii, the third line of heavy troops in a Roman army of the period. So at some point you have to replace your front line with your second line. So your front line has gone in, there's a battle happening, they've thrown their peeler, they've got stuck in with the swords, and they're fighting, but maybe they start getting tired, maybe they start getting beaten, maybe they start doing well, and if you hit the enemy now, you will rout the enemy. But for whatever reason, there comes a point where you want to throw your second line in. But how do you do this? Because if you've got a continuous wall of men all fighting in front of you, then as you bring up a continuous wall of your second line, well, you've got loads of your own guys, loads of corpses, loads of screaming wounded, loads of quite objectionable, frankly, enemy, all in front of you, making that extremely inconvenient. If you just slam into the back of your own guys, how are you helping your own guys? And if your own guys turn around and try to pull back and run away, where are they going to go? Because you've got a solid wall of troops coming forwards. And if they all pull back at the same time, that might cause the enemy to surge forward, and then you've got a rout on your hands, and you've got loads of men who can't get out of the way. So there's a big problem. Now, what you can do, of course, is have what are often termed intervals. So you have a block of men, be that a century or a maniple, and then you have an interval between it and the next block, so that if you move forwards in blocks like this, then when the line in front of you does need to withdraw, it can withdraw through those intervals. But even that doesn't make everything clear, because if the first line withdrawing goes through these intervals, what happens if the enemy then charges after that first line, turns a withdrawal into a rout, and then passes through those intervals? Then your second line coming forwards suddenly finds itself surrounded, and that could precipitate disaster. So you need some method of feeding men in and getting men out which doesn't cause a sudden surge of the enemy, a sudden rout, a sudden collapse of formation. You've got to come up with some orderly way of getting units of men to replace others whilst keeping up the pressure on the enemy. Now, of course, there might be a lull, there might be a convenient lull when you can pull back and the enemy is also pulling back and he's reordering his lines and so forth. That could happen, but let's imagine that it doesn't, that the enemy's keeping up the pressure and you don't have a convenient lull. How do you do it? So that's the maniple swap problem, if you like. And there are loads of people. There's absolutely, I know this from, I must have been talking about maniple swaps for 20 years. There's no shortage in this world of people who will tell you very precisely what a maniple swap was, and how everyone else's version is just wrong. I don't want to become one of those people, so I'm not in this video going to tell you exactly what one was and exactly how it was done, but I will propose, at least what I think is a reasonably feasible way of doing it, and the way that I'm thinking of doing it in the book. But I'm also getting in my retaliation early, because I think that if I do put a maniple swap in the book, then there are people who feel that they know what a maniple swap was, who will go, oh, he's got maniple swap wrong. Yeah, that's not how it was done. So I'm going to say to them now, you don't know. Nobody knows. In fact, a lot of people question whether maniple swaps actually happened at all. Now, there's something known as checkerboarding, If you've seen the 1960 film, I think 60, by Stanley Kubrick, Spartacus, then you've seen a very impressive array of Italian soldiers dressed up as Romans doing a checkerboard formation and advancing in a very impressive way with good music playing and so forth on this big, expansive battlefield. Yeah, a word about battlefields, actually. Hate to break it to you, I know this ruins an awful lot of films, but battlefields didn't actually exist. There were no large, smooth, open, treeless areas of just plain ground that was set aside for having battles on. The countryside was actually farmed for the most part and would have fences and villages and copses and all the inconvenient things that would get in the way of troops trying to fight a battle. But the fact is that you cannot always, in fact, you usually can't choose your ground perfectly, and you have to fight the enemy where the battle just happens to end up happening. So the chances are that you won't have a beautiful, plain, open battlefield to fight on. Yes, it's true that some generals would sometimes try to contrive things that way, and they did sometimes succeed, but battlefields, areas for having battles on, didn't exist. It's a bit of a bête noire of mine. Sorry, I see this in so many films. What a convenient open area to fight on. Never mind. So there they are, moving in this checkerboard formation that looks very nice. And you'll notice that they have corners touching. But then they don't do anything with it. They don't actually fight in a checkerboard formation. Before the battle starts, they do a bit more quite impressive manoeuvring. And then they just form up into one great big block. And that's what advances on the enemy. And then, of course, as soon as the block actually, as soon as the two sides get to grips with each other, the usual thing happens that all formation just dissolves and everyone pairs off and does that thing where you hold a shield behind you as a counterweight and you go ting, 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 ting with your sword, and then the cavalry charge in and come to, yeah, it's the usual stuff. But anyway, you see that Quincunx. Now, Quincunx is a Latin term that refers to, well, I went to my local war games club just recently and had a conversation about maniple swaps because I was thinking of doing this video, and I was talking to two guys who do a lot of ancient wargaming, and they have over the years experimented with different wargame rules for simulating the maniple swap. And they mentioned, well, what about the Quincunx? And I was a little bit unsure of my ground, so I just wrote it down and nodded sagely because I didn't want to argue back. But I think it's a Latin term. Now, for our period, the historians are writing in Greek. And yes, it's true that the word checkerboard is, of course, modern English, and that in Latin it's sometimes referred to as the Quincunx, but it's not really the 5. It's not so much the number, it's the geometric pattern. Quincunx is also a coin, by the way, just in case you're curious. They look like that. Well, at least some of them did, and they were worth 5/12 of an as. But if you roll a die today, a d6, it probably has a Quincunx on it, which is this pattern. So you can imagine if you get that pattern, loads of them next to each other, you've got a sort of a checkerboard type formation. So it was a way of describing a checkerboard. The 5 could be, as one of my wargamer friends put it, it could be hastati, hastati, principes, triari, triari. And there you go, that's the 5 formation. So they must have fought like that, what was his argument. But right, there are some problems. One being, of course, that you actually have the same number of principes as hastati. So perhaps the 5, if it were a 5, would be hastati, hastati, principes, principes, triari, which, it doesn't look like a die now, does it? And that's just a way of contriving 5. I'm fairly convinced that this word was being used in its reference to the formation, the geometric pattern of the Quincunx, and so it was their way of saying checkerboarded. So why would soldiers operate in checkerboard formations? Well, one thing that most people are pretty agreed on is that it's a convenience for maneuver. If you've got a massive line that's very deep and very broad and you want to move it, it's very difficult. As you move forwards, there are going to be things, little woods, villages, farmhouses, rocks, streams, all sorts of things that break up the ground, and that will break up your formation, and it's very difficult to move forwards in a great big wide mass like that. And if you want to wheel then the guys towards the one end have got to be walking increasingly slowly until perhaps right at the very end you've got one guy who's maybe standing stationary and everyone else has to speed up, and you can very slowly wheel, and it can take ages to wheel a really big formation of guys, particularly across rough ground. So if you form up into lots of little blocks, those little blocks can all maneuver, and those guys, those centuries, those maniples, they would know each other, because that's how Romans drilled, and that's how they camped and spent their lives. They would be with the guys in their century, in their small units. They would perhaps share a tent with the guys just in their unit of 10, and there would be 6 of these units of 10 in a Punic War period century. And when they camped, they would have those tents next to each other, and they would cook with and share meals with and do all sorts of tasks with other men in their own century. So they would know the guys in their century, and they would train with them. If you'd been on campaign as a Roman soldier for any length of time, you might be mobilized at some point. It might be months before you actually get into action with the enemy. You've had months every day to get to know the other guys in your unit and to drill with them, to march with them, to train with them, and to get used to receiving and taking orders and reacting to trumpet calls, getting to know the voice and the commands of your centurion, your optio, the two commanders of the century. So they would know their stuff. So in that little unit, you can move quite efficiently, and to move an army across a big landscape in little blocks is much more efficient, and they can quickly get into position. And then if you want to form a line along that diagonal, you can just do it quickly in lots of little blocks, and the guys could do it at the trot. And that was a much more efficient way of moving. And of course, if there is anything like a copse, for instance, you can just move around it. Now, you know, don't you, that it's much easier to move in a narrow frontage than a wide frontage. If you've been, I don't know, on some school trip and you're walking across the countryside, you don't spread out sideways, do you, and then try to walk across the landscape like that. No, you follow the guy in front, and you find a path, you find the easiest route, and you all go one behind the other. It's much quicker and easier to move like that. Well, if you have loads of small units, then you can maneuver much more easily. So you can quickly get into position, and then if you do need to close up the line, well, then you will have learnt maneuvers for closing up the line. So you could change a Quincunx formation into a solid line pretty quickly. The centurions could relay along the line, blow whistles, ask their cornisons to blow trumpets and so forth, and it could happen. So speed of maneuver is one reason for doing it. And a lot of people will argue, that's all the Quincunx was for. It was just for maneuver, and they didn't fight like that. But there are people who think that they did fight like that, that they would actually clash with the enemy in Quincunx formation. So you would have one unit forward, one unit back, possibly touching at the corner, possibly not, and gaps in between. So if, let's imagine that the enemy has a continuous line, so you've got loads of Gauls, and they're just a great block of Gauls continuously, you'll have a load of Romans hitting them, then a gap, then a load of Romans hitting them, then a gap, then a load of Romans hitting them. And a lot of people will say, well, that's just ridiculous. I mean, you know, the enemy would just flood into the gaps and hit the sides of the front units, and they couldn't possibly have done that. Well, maybe, but then maybe not. You see, we don't know about the timing. Maybe one lot of the forward units of the Quincunx would hit, and the second unit would hit only a short while later. So if you've got shock troops, the legionary does not fight like the Greeks of a phalanx, where you move slowly up to the enemy, and then you fight with your spears, and you try to slowly push the enemy back. They are shock troops that go smashing in. They throw their pila and immediately follow up those pila with their short swords, their gladius hispaniensis or whatever, and they try to smash into the enemy. So if you've got a continuous wall of enemy and you smash into them, then you're going to dent the line a little bit and get a little bulge, and then you've got a little bit of disruption. So if you've got disruption gap all the way along the line, then when the second unit goes in, maybe only a few seconds later, you're hitting something that's already a bit disrupted, because as the units that do charge forwards go forwards, the guys in a position to receive are probably going to prefer to be guys who are in the position in front of one of the gaps. So if there's if for instance, I'm a Gaul, and I can see a Roman coming straight at me, and there and there and there and there and there are more Romans, but there and there and there, there's a gap there, okay? So I'm quite likely to try to receive this charge like this, right? But I'm unlikely to be on my own. A lot of the guys around me are perhaps going to be trying to maneuver into that gap as well, because it seems safer, and you can put your shield in front of you, and you can look, you can look brave. Oh, okay, come on then, Romans, I've got you. And so you may actually create a weak spot if you're charging irregular troops like Gauls, and if you've got regular troops with well-drilled regular troops with this devastating weapon, this devastating initial charge, you could create weak spots, and you create bunches of guys who then bulge out of formation in those gaps, who then get hit by the next lot. So it's a bit like forming a spear point, forming a Swinberg, forming a pig snout, forming a wedge, and you smash into the line in order to create disruption, and then what follows that wedge should be able to capitalize on the disruption caused by the wedge. But one of the problems with the wedge is that you need a psycho to be right at the point of the wedge. But if you've got a unit that's much smaller, but it's still you get part of the effect of a wedge, I suppose is what I'm saying, by having a smaller unit crash into the enemy. Now, there are loads of possibilities as to what that unit was. Was it a maniple? Was it a century? One commonly conjectured formation of the Roman army is that you have a maniple, then a maniple width gap, and then another maniple, and that's the front line. And in that maniple width gap, you have the maniples of the second line, either immediately touching corner to corner or back a bit with an interval. And there are many people who will tell you that it's definitely one or definitely other. And there are people who will tell you that it's definitely the case that the spaces in between the maniples were not one full maniple width. And there are also people who will argue quite forcefully for the centuries being one behind the other or one alongside the other. Now, we are told in the literature that there's the forward one and the rear one, the posterior one and the anterior one. So that suggests, okay, so one century was formed in front of the other. But we also are told, for instance, this is in Polybius, I read it quite recently, that one of the centurions in a maniple commanded the left-hand century, and the other one commanded the right-hand century. So that suggests that they're side by side. And of course, a complication is that they could move into position like that and then do that. And this one might still be called the posterior century because that's where it came from. So a complication. And loads of people have drawn up all sorts of different schemes on paper to try to rationalize and get to grips with this idea of the maniple swap. You might want to research it yourself, but you may feel that you're completely lost. I mean, how can you can't read the original sources? You don't read ancient Greek? Well, maybe you could, because maybe you could get yourself along to www.thegreatcoursesplus.com/Lindy and there find a landing page which will give you an introductory free month to all the lecture courses of the Great Courses Plus. There are many of these on all sorts of topics, and one of them, I noticed, is Ancient Greek. Yes, so it's 36 half-hour lectures. Now you may say, well, you couldn't master Ancient Greek in that time. Well, no, you couldn't master it, but I think you could get quite usefully familiar with it, at least when you look at Ancient Greek, which to the uninitiated just makes the sound in your head. That's not language, it's just gobbledygook, alien script, but at least you'll learn the alphabet, you'll learn the basic pronunciation, you'll learn word order, and you'll start to, oh, that's a noun, that must be a verb, and you'll start to get at least a feel for it. And if you are a fan of wild, unkempt hair, and the fact that you're watching this channel at all shows that you must be at least tolerant of it, then you're going to love this guy. I mean, look at that hair. Wow. And you know that he's a distinguished scholar because he can do the scholar's cradle. I mean, I could, you see, I wasn't, but he, without looking, watch this, he does a double. Watch this. 1, 2. Yeah. Oh yeah. He does the double, and you know you know that a guy is good without even looking. I mean, just every single figure, so precise. So you know this guy knows his stuff. So that's one of the very many courses that's on offer at the Great Courses Plus. So you can get yourself along for a free month. I mean, what can you lose? Right, now, what do I think actually happened? Well, of course, I don't know. And the first thing I have to admit to myself is I don't know. But there is something which I quite like, is that I quite like the idea that it actually happened century by century. I think it's reasonable that the sub-commanders were given some initiative. These guys, these centurions, were experienced soldiers who'd been elected by their peers, and they'd been on campaign and they had drilled with their guys a lot. They knew their guys knew their voice, knew their style of command, and they could look at what was happening where their particular century was and make sensible decisions accordingly on the spot. The overall commander of an army can't micromanage every century. He's got to be able to rely on his junior officers to some degree. And so I think they did. And I think that the century is a very flexible unit. They kept the century. And if they do have this, well, we know from the literature reasonably confidently that there were 2 centuries per maniple, and that these did maneuver separately to at least some degree, even if the fighting unit was considered to be the maniple. So this unit could make little tactical local moves in accordance with accidents of ground and the particular story of what's going on in that part of the battlefield. Now, we don't know exactly how many men there were, but there are something like 60 to 64 men in a century, and we don't know exactly what frontage they have. But we think that in close formation, in close combat, a man occupied something like 2.5 feet. If you get 2 bunched up, then you can't fight properly because you don't have the room to wield your weapons. So about 2.5 feet. So if they were in, as is commonly thought, 6 files of 10, that's 6 times 2.5 feet. It's only 15 feet. It's only let's check that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, it's 15 feet, which is really not very far. So if there is a century here, and next to it is a rock, a wagon, a clump of trees, a house, a barn, there are loads of things. 15 feet is really not very far. So it's very easy to imagine that there might be some accident to ground which breaks up a formation, and that you can then cope with it. So you look at what's happening in your area. Oh, we've got a clump of trees where we are. Their area is quite open, but we've got this clump of trees to sort out. So the local centurion makes a sensible decision and says, okay, we'll just go in with 1 century. You fall back, guys. And when we come back, you can then hit the side. So if the front unit in contact with the enemy falls back, then if the enemy does surge forward, this unit is in a position to crash into its flank, and they're ready. They're only 15 feet away. Now, when you do hit the enemy, let's imagine that there isn't an accident on the ground now, and that there's just a constant wall of Gauls or whatever. You've smashed in with 1 century. The second unit is not many 15 feet. Even if the depth is greater, even if the depth is 5 foot per man, and there are 10 of you, it's still only 25 feet, and you could throw a pilum 25 feet, and you could follow up with you and another pilum, and then your gladius very, very quickly. So the idea that the enemy would just flood into that gap, I think is not true, because would you go into that gap? It's a killing box. If you, as a Gaul, charge into that gap, then turn sideways in order to have a fight with the guys on the sides of the forward centuries, then the rear centuries can be chucking their pila straight into you. If you've turned left, you've exposed your shieldless side to a great volley of pila. You're dead. And if you surge into that area and lose formation, then a unit that's in formation with pila standing at the ready could go charging straight into you. For them, it's Christmas. Oh, wow, they've flooded the gap. We'll have them. So I think that it's perfectly feasible that they did fight in a Quincunx formation. I think that the maniple swap was probably done by centuries rather than by whole maniples at a time. But I also believe that the local commander would have made a sensible decision. So sometimes because of the situation, because of the particular layout of the ground, he might decide to do it as a whole maniple at a time rather than a century. The idea that this beautiful geometric pattern can be maintained right the way across a battlefield under battlefield conditions is, I think, rather ridiculous. Yes, I think it's feasible. I don't know if these swaps actually happen like that, but I think it's feasible. I was watching Rome, the HBO series, and you'll notice that another of the many possibles is that it was done file by file, and they actually show there's an above shot to show this, to show how clever they've been, that these incredibly constricted lines, these guys do not have room to fight properly, and they're moving, they're swapping guys in and out by files rather than by centuries or maniples. To be honest, I wasn't convinced by that, but some people clearly who've read books and everything, and some of them can even, I'm looking, I know that's cheating, can even do that. You know, they think that's how it was done, and they're not necessarily wrong just because I've contradicted them. Good Lord, what do I know? I'm just some bloke off the interweb. The